Читать не надо, просто как есть кусок.
what level of awareness about languages of Tajmyr and languages of Siberia I shall suspect in the audience. And that's why maybe sometimes I may lean towards saying too curious things that all you know, but sometimes lean towards saying too specific things as if you were specialists on these languages, but I'll try to stay mostly in the middle. So this is the map of Russia. Russia is shown as lighter than all the other countries. And then you have Siberia, which is defined basically as the Asian part of Russia. And it is the only course on languages of Siberia in the program. I thought I shall say also a couple of words about languages of Siberia in general. But before I go to the linguistic part, I have some pictures. And so this is a picture of, this is a physical map of Tajmyr. So Tajmyr is this peninsula in the basically central Siberia, in the north of Central Siberia. As you see here, and as you will see on the map on the next slide, there are mountains in the very north of Tajmyr. There are mountains in the south of Tajmyr. So you have mountains here. So this is all this area is Tajmyr. You have mountains here, and you have mountains basically making the southern border of Tajmyr. And this is tundra, and part of it is forest tundra. Basically, the southern part of it, the tree line goes somewhere here, and the tree line goes from southwest to northeast. It doesn't go by parallel. And you have forest tundra here and plain tundra there, and some pictures just to give you a visual idea of what we are talking about. Very good quality, but this is basically plain tundra without forest, which is more to the north. And this is a modern picture with some Nenets, tents. Then you also know whether you see anything. There are some reindeer which cross this kind of plain tundra. Can you do something to make it darker? They also show maps. You just see maps.
I think the first one is the one close to you.
Maybe.
Yeah. But then you have to go close to it.
Well, maybe. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, this is the very typical plain tundra with lots of small bushes and moss and reindeer. And as you see, the reindeer, they carry sledges, and they do it both in summer and winter. So this moss is, even in summer, it's quite wet, so you basically can continue using reindeer and sledges. These are all Tundra Nenets pictures. And this is the kind of forest you don't really see. But the fact is that the forest is not very dense. Basically, this would be trees which are not much higher than myself, and which have quite a big distance between different trees. So it's not a real forest. And then you have a picture from a helicopter which shows you how much water there is around. So these are non-mountains areas, and it's really a lot of lakes and rivers and all kind of watery things. Then you have some winter picture, and this is the forest, so you can see it here. It's quite weak as a forest. And this is a picture of from the mountain range to the south, in the south of Tajmyr. So these mountains are also pretty tundra-like. So they're not really, they do not look like Alps, but plainer. And this is a picture of a village, because today most people in Tajmyr live in villages, not in towns anymore. And this is a winter picture of a village. And this is a summer picture of a village. It's a small village near the bank of the river. And here you have some local people. This is a Tundra Nenets, Tundra Nenets family. The woman is Tundra Nenets, the man is Tundra Nenets. And this is, they have reindeer and they dwell with them in Tundra. This is a village. And a man living in a village but wearing a traditional clothes. And this is quite typical, so kind of in winter maybe half of people in a village would wear the traditional clothes, just because they're much more practical than modern European clothes. And this is a forest Enets in summer, collecting some berries with linguists. So these are just some pictures. Now some basic facts about languages of Siberia. Today there are about 100 languages spoken in Siberia. Unfortunately, this does not mean that you can really hear 100 languages being spoken today. It's more about that there are people who can speak, have the ability to speak about 100 languages. Most of these languages are now endangered due to a massive language shift to Russian. Some 350 years ago, when the colonization of the northern Siberia started, the number of languages was presumably much higher. If we speak about the whole Siberia, we know for sure that there were at least 520 clans, and usually you would suspect about, I don't know, 3 clans per language, with some places where each clan would speak their own language, and some places where kind of 6 or 7 clans could speak the same language. Yes, and so this is a linguistic picture of Siberia in the 17th century. I'll say in a minute where we know the dates in the 17th century. And by different colors, you have different linguistic families here. So if we go from the west, basically here are the Uralic mountains, which separate European Russia from Asian Russia. And you have Uralic languages, including Samoyedic in the north and Yurak in the south. And we have Turkic languages in blue. We have Yeniseian languages in yellow. We have Tungusic languages in green. Mongolic languages in red. Yurak languages in yellow and greenish. And then some Chukotko-Kamchatka in gray and Eskimo Aleut are in pink. And this is the Tajmyr Peninsula. And you see that basically the northern part of it is uninhabited just because it's too far north and people cannot live there. And this is the 7th century. And for comparison, this is a picture for the beginning of the 20th century. And if we kind of click between these two maps, you see the main difference is that everyone kind of moves more to the north, because this is a kind of way where the Russians colonized Siberia. So white is Russian, white is where no indigenous language is spoken, and basically they went this way and people either escape more to the south or more to the north from that. So if you have Turkic, blue Turkic here, basically they either disappeared or kind of moved more to the south. Then the Uralic languages over here didn't really change much, but these are southern Samoyedic languages, which basically disappeared. And then you have these Mongolic languages in red, which were kind of squeezed a little bit. And then look at the Yakut. This is blue is Turkic, and this is the Turkic language Yakut, which was just a little bit in the 17th century, and then it's all over the central Siberia and western part of eastern Siberia. And this, in a sense, was not connected with Russian colonization, it was just the expansion of Yakut. The same is true for Chukchi, who occupied quite a small territory over here, but expanded to the west. Due to the Yurak. And then you have the very small remains of Eskimo Aleut, who took somewhat more place, but again it was not due to Russian colonization, but due to Chukchi expansion over there. Okay, this is kind of very general information about languages of Siberia. And basically, where do we take it from? We take it from this map. And this is a map of Siberian clans for the 17th century. And it comes from the first reference, which is a book by a Soviet ethnographer and anthropologist, Boris Dolgan, which is called Clans and Tribes of Siberia in the 17th century. And this is a great book which gives us a lot of information about ethnic contents of Siberia for the time, and basically in many cases we know kind of which clan, because here all these circles are clans, and the color shows the again Uralic, Turkic, Tungusic, and so on. And so for most clans we know which kind of language they spoke because these clans survived till the 20th century. And of course there was some assimilation, but generally the picture can be restored quite well. And how did this Dolgan reconstruct it all? He basically studied a lot of tribute records. Tribute, that was the furs which the indigenous peoples were supposed to pay to the Russians. And this was an annual measure, so every year local people were supposed to bring furs, and the local administrative bodies took quite a good record of who brought what. And basically they called people by their clan names, because that's how they introduced themselves. And that's and also they wrote down very carefully from where this person, calling himself, this clan name came. So like names of rivers, of some important parts of landscape. And that's how this kind of ethnic history of Siberia can be reconstructed for the 17th century. This is a book in Russian, and it's quite hard to read it, so it's really kind of an academic monograph with a lot of details and all the references in which exact archive and which exact page you can find this kind of information. And this is a very popular book, and it's in English, and it gives a very good summary of these and many others, and it's called The History of Peoples of Siberia, and if you're interested in the matter, it's really a very good source to start with. So that was basic facts about Siberia, and now we go back to Tajmyr, and this is an administrative map of Tajmyr, and importantly, it does not coincide, it's bigger than the physical Tajmyr. So the physical peninsula, this is the Yenisei River, which flows into the sea, the Arctic Sea, and physically the left bank of the Yenisei is not Tajmyr peninsula, but administratively it is, and we will study it as it because people on the left bank of the Yenisei River have a lot of connections to the people on the right bank of the Yenisei River. And the same here, the peninsula physically finishes with this river, Khanina first, and then Khatanga, and then to the Khatanga Bay. But the Tajmyr administratively goes also to the south and east. And this is what it is. This is finally the area that I will be speaking about. So, what are the languages and ethnic groups of Tajmyr? We have several Uralic, all northern Samoyedic languages. Tundra Nenets, Enets and Nganasan, those languages which are spoken today. There was also a language called Yurak, which was a kind of intermediate between Tundra Nenets and Enets, and which became extinct by the middle of the 19th century. So basically, the Yuraks were assimilated by Tundra Nenets and the Enets. Enets is divided into forest and tundra, and the distinction between these two idioms is on the borderline between language and dialect. So they're quite close, but they're a little bit separate. And so some people call them two Enets languages: forest Enets language and tundra Enets language. Some people call them dialects, but it's really kind of a terminology debate. In English, you can easily just call them Enets, forest Enets and tundra Enets, without specifying what exactly you mean. And importantly, on the maps and in the stories that I will tell you, forest Enets and tundra Enets will always feature separately because the languages are very similar, but ethnically, these two groups are very different. They live in different places and they do not count each other as a part of their community. So the Tundra Nenets do not think that they're the same people as forest Enets and vice versa. And basically they shared the same territory in the 19th century, but the last 100 years they have not met each other. So basically, usually the forest Enets think that Tundra Nenets and Nganasan are more or less the same. Some people that live in the north, so they have come and met them. Those who have met, they usually meet in a hospital. And so it's a very kind of today modern civilizational context. So they are definitely different ethnic groups, forest Enets and tundra Enets. And today I will speak mostly about ethnic groups and ethnic history, not about linguistic structures. And then you'll have to wait till tomorrow, I think, to know more about the difference between them linguistically. Then we have, so Tundra Nenets, the two Enets varieties, and Nganasan, which are modern Samoyedic languages. And then there is a Turkic language, Dolgan. It's quite similar to Yakut. So basically, Yakut or Saha is the closest relative of Dolgan from the Turkic family. And it has some features from Tungusic languages and northern Samoyedic languages, just because there was a lot of linguistic and ethnic and genetic admixture that made the Dolgan ethnic group and the Dolgan language. And then we have Evenki language at the very south of Tajmyr. And actually, if we speak about today, the Evenkis are definitely their smallest ethnic group, given their language. So they basically all were assimilated by the Dolgans, all went away to the south, and they're not in Tajmyr anymore. And then we have Russian, and it's not only Russian, the 20th century Russian, but also there were some Russian speakers in the 19th century, the 18th century, and some of them later were assimilated by the Dolgans, or kind of made a part of the Dolgan ethnic group. And also there is this interesting language which is called Russian-based pidgin Govorka, which is also extinct by now, like Yurak. But if Yurak disappeared in the middle of the 19th century, Govorka was still used by people in the end of the 1990s, so very recently. And so it seems like today there is no one speaking Govorka, but we have quite recent recordings of this idiom. And I will speak about it, but so today's lecture is about general history of the general introduction and history of the languages of Tajmyr, and also the last bit will be devoted to the Russian-based pidgin. Okay, you have a map of all languages of Tajmyr shown usually in space. This is a map which is true for the beginning of the 20th century. I'll go through it language by language so that it makes easier. So if we start from the west, first we have Tundra Nenets. And Tundra Nenets is a language which is spoken basically till the White Sea, till European Russia in the west. And it goes all the way, and this is where the Tundra Nenets language kind of stops. And by the beginning of the 20th century, they were a little bit on the right bank of the Yenisei River and mainly on the left bank of the Yenisei. Then we have forest Enets here in the southeast of the Tundra Nenets territory. And you immediately see that forest Enets, that the territory of the forest Enets in the beginning of the 20th century completely coincides with some part of the Tundra Nenets territory. So the language contact tissue immediately pops up here on the very first picture. Then you have Tundra Nenets, which is more to the north, and which partly who partly live together with the Tundra Nenets, but not completely, not unlike the forest Enets. And then you have the Nganasans, who share some territory with the Tundra Enets and a little bit with the Tundra Nenets, and basically go all the way to the eastern border of Tajmyr. And then you have the Dolgans, which are even more to the north, more to the east than the Nganasans, and they share some part of their territory with the Nganasans. And this is for the beginning of the 20th century. I will always give a date because, as you will see, the situation basically changes every half century, or even more so in the 20th century, because people move all the time. And that's why this is true for this period, but if we go like 50 years earlier, if we speak about the second half of the 19th century, then the Dolgans will be much to the south and have quite little intersection with the Dolgans, with the Nganasans. And for some reason, this colorful map doesn't show the Evenkis with the color, but they are to the south of all these peoples. And as you see, this is exactly the southern border of Tajmyr. So basically, the Tajmyr ends somewhere here. So the Evenkis in the 20th century just up the very south of it. Do you have any questions? Shall we ask questions now? Yes.
Is it true that in Govorka you have all three, Nganasan, Tundra Nenets, and Tundra Nenets?
Yes, this is the area where you don't see the intersection of colors here, but yes, in the area around Govorka, you have these three ethnic groups together. That's right.
So there are many settlements, right? It's not only one.
No. This is a very important point that I was going to make, that the density of population is very, very low. So basically, if you speak of the number of kilometers, this is about 500 kilometers from here to here, and maybe 600 from here. And this is about 1,000 kilometers, so it's a huge area. And each color color spot here corresponds to about from 300 to 600 people. So there are very few people living here. And so all this yellow, the Nganasans, it's about, well, maybe it was the beginning of the 20th century, it's about 1,000, but that's really huge territory. And when we speak about this area, when they all intersect, it basically means that there are about from 10 to 20 families living, sharing 10 to 20 families, some of which are Tundra Nenets, some of which are Tundra Nenets, and some of which are Nganasan.
Do they live in the same settlement?
No, they are, well,
sorry,
it was a bit too early to suggest to ask questions. So I shall say a couple of words about their culture so that you have the idea of how they live. So these peoples are all nomadic. There are those in the very south, so basically these people can be semi-nomadic, but all the northern, and the main bulk of them is northern, are completely nomadic. Nomadic meaning changing hundreds of kilometers within a year for their place of living. They had completely no settlements till basically the middle of the 20th century. So there were settlements there, and that's why you have some villages like Uralic and Chihu, but these were only the Russians, only the newcomers, the colonizers, the administrative people, the merchants who lived in the settlements. There were some few local people who lived there, but they basically, it meant that they intermarried with the Russians. And they were all nomadic or semi-nomadic. And the main reason why they were nomadic, because the reindeer, wild reindeer or domestic reindeer, was the main source of their food, clothes, transport, housing, basically everything. And reindeer change their places, migrate all the time, both wild reindeer and domestic reindeer. And this is generally the big migrations are seasonal. So in winter, all reindeer need to go to the south, so that these small forests cover them from the winds, and also because in the forest the layer of snow is thinner and it's easier for reindeer to dig out the moss. And in summer, all the reindeer need to go to the north, because the more you go to the north, the stronger are the winds, and there will be less mosquitoes. And the mosquitoes are quite an annoyance for the reindeer as well, not only for people. And basically, if you have your domestic reindeer, you need to bring them to the south in winter and to the north in summer, otherwise they will just die out. And the wild reindeer that I usually hunted for, they also go to the south in winter, to the north in summer. So that's why you have these big migrations, but even within winter, and winter is about 9 months of the year, so from like September, October till May, and this is winter. And then during winter and during summer, you do not stay in the same place, because your reindeer need to eat moss, and then they eat up all the moss which is here, and you need to move them to a different place. But within a season, this changing of movements would be dozens of kilometers, not really hundreds, and the seasonal migrations would be hundreds of kilometers. Yes, and besides the reindeer, they do hunting and fishing, and basically till the end of the 19th century, they didn't have fire guns, so it was all very, very traditional with arrows and bows. And you send it manually, not with the help of a bow.
Spears?
Yeah, spears. Yes, and surprisingly, there is very limited gathering. So these people are hunter-gatherers, but they don't gather anything. there are some berries, there are some herbs in summer, and some roots, but they are not really interested in them. They could be, some herbs can be used for healing, but very occasionally, and generally they are not, like there are quite a lot of mushroom in summer, but they think that, a lot of people think that mushrooms are for the reindeer, not for people, and so they really are not interested in this vegetation. Basically, they eat reindeer, they eat fish, and some birds like goose and other small kind of birds, and they're small. Socially, there were numerous clans for each of this ethnic group, and this clan kind of dictated the marriage patterns and the rules of mutual help, and kind of if you have a lot of reindeer, and I do not have a lot, I have few reindeer, or my reindeer died, then I could go to someone from the same clan and he will help me with meat, with reindeer, and so on. Socially, and then they all practice shamanism, except the Dolgans, who were kind of quite early to be baptized. Even when they were baptized, they kind of their Christian traditions coexisted with their traditional stuff like shamanism. And shamanism means that there are shamans who make these ceremonies, but also that there are quite a lot of idols and kind of sacred objects that people carry with them. And there are also sacred sites in space, in tundra or in forest, where people, which are important for people. And this is a picture of a traditional symmetry, basically. This is a Tundra Nenets and Tundra Nenets symmetry. And so this is permafrost, so you cannot really dig out many things in the earth, in the ground. And so they put their deceased people on the ground and build kind of a wooden box on them. Okay. Yeah, the general introduction is over. So if you have questions for this general introduction part, you can ask them now. Okay, now I come more to the ethnic and linguistic history of the last 300 years. So this is that map of all the clans in the 17th century, and the red square, whatever it is, shows you the Tajmyr. And so we see here the Samoyedic peoples in blue, and then Evenki, the Tungusic clans in green. And here we zoom in. Unfortunately, this picture is in Russian and the colors have changed, but I will guide you through. So the Tajmyr actually, this is the Yenisei River. So the Tajmyr is all the way to the right of this picture, but it is important because I show you this picture which is more to the left, more to the west and south than the Tajmyr is, but basically because these are the people who all moved north and east since the 17th century, and these are the clans that basically inhabited the Tajmyr Peninsula in the 20th century. And yeah, these arrows show you all this movement. Basically, all this movement were conditioned by the colonization of Siberia. The colonization of Siberia mainly proceeded much more to the south, but then all the southern people moved to the north, and they moved these people as they moved these people. So kind of it was a gradual movement during since the 17th century till the 19th century. And then the 20th century history is a bit different. So the orange, this is the forest Enets group. This is the Tundra Nenets group. This is the Tundra Nenets group. This is the forest Nenets. This is hunting, which is of Yurak and which never reached Tajmyr. This is Samoyedic. Basically, there's Nganasans. but we know for sure that only this group, which goes more to the east and to the north, were the Nganasans, and maybe in the 17th century these two groups were speaking Tundra Nenets or something quite similar to Tundra Nenets, something intermediate between Tundra Nenets and Nganasans. But then by the 19th century, these were the Nganasans who lived in this territory and who belonged to the same clans as these two. And this is the Evenkis, which also moved further north. And this is the migrational history, not migrational, kind of how the traditional territories changed during the 20th century. So this was even, you have a lot of pictures here. I will comment you through. So this is the second half of the 19th century. This is the first third of the 20th century, and this is the middle of the 20th century. And this is the Yenisei River. So it's we moved a little bit to the east, but not completely. And so the very eastern part of Tajmyr is not shown here. And this, there is no reason why it is not shown beyond that I just am specialist more in the western part of Tajmyr. So that's why I have very nice maps for this western part. But basically, you can continue the same orange to the east, and the same orange and the same green and purple, and then you will have the end of Tajmyr somewhere here. So the situation didn't change that much on the part of the picture which is not shown. So what is important? You look at the Tundra Nenets, which is pink, and which is the westernmost ethnic group. And then you look at this pink in these three pictures, and you see that the Tundra Nenets expanded a lot to the east. And they not only expanded, but they assimilated those peoples who lived in the territory where they arrived. So there is no pink on the right bank of the Yenisei in the 19th century. Then you have some pink here, and you have much more pink by the middle of the 20th century. There are no more pictures after the 1940s, 1960s, just because there is the history of indigenous peoples basically stopped, and they started being all assimilated by Russians, and by Russian as a language, but Russian as a way of living. And so that's why the ethnic history doesn't really change after this point. So this was the pink Tundra Nenets. Then we can look at this big red Tundra Nenets. And again, they occupy a huge territory here. Then they become more partly assimilated by the Tundra Nenets, and even more assimilated by the Tundra Nenets. And you see here like an arrow, and there was a big migration of a part of Tundra Nenets to the Nganasan lands. So and then they started living together with the Nganasans. And this was this movement during, so if this is the second half of the 19th century, this is 1960s, so basically about 100 years that this changed. This is not seen by these people as something dramatic, as something very bad that has happened to them. This is taken because this is a continuation of what I had shown you earlier. So there is no idea of traditional lands, like in Australia maybe. No idea that this is my land because my great-grandparents lived here. So basically my land is where I hunt, where I fish, where I have my reindeer, but this may change. Like, we used to go there, but now we don't go there anymore. So it's really, it's not, these changes are not seen by people as something negative, well, or something positive. It's just very neutral. They just move, and they tell you, earlier we used to live over there, and our parents used to hunt here and here, but now we do it here and there. So it's really quite specific, and I'm not sure whether this has to be attributed to the nomadity of these people and the fact that they generally change the place where they sleep all the time, or it's somehow about the reason beyond this neutrality and this tolerance to kind of land issues, maybe somewhere else. Okay, then if we look at this forest Enets, which were here, and we see that here they intersected with Tundra Nenets. So Tundra Nenets and forest Enets and Tundra Nenets were the three groups which occupied this territory in winter in the second half of the 19th century. But if we move here, we see that 50 years later, Tundra Nenets do not come that much themselves anymore. They really don't know why they stopped going that further south. They just stopped. But then you see that the brownish part, which is actually forest Enets, became a bit bigger. But it became bigger only to be later assimilated by the Tundra Nenets, because this was a small group, forest Enets, and they came to the lands of Tundra Nenets, but they were so few in comparison to the numbers of the Tundra Nenets that they met there, so that they became assimilated by them and basically switched to their language and intermarried with them. And this is, again, if we speak about the size of this territory, it's about maybe 100 to 100 kilometers, and it's about 300 to 500 people living here. So it's really not many people meeting each other every day. Then, if you look at the Nganasan territories, they didn't really change in these 50 years. But in these 50 years, they basically changed because the Nganasan stopped going that much to the west, and they were complemented by the Tundra Nenets who came to them. And then if you look at the Dolgans, then the interesting history behind them is that the end of the 19th century was a time when it was kind of the final period of the emergence of the Dolgan as an ethnic group, and that's why there were still some Russians living not in settlements, but living in tundra and hunting and fishing, basically following the same traditional lifestyle, and they were all assimilated by the Dolgans. And also we have here some Tundra Nenets and some forest Enets, which also became assimilated by the Dolgans, and some Evenkis, which also became assimilated by the Dolgans. And then also you see much more white in the last picture, meaning that the traditional, just generally by the end of the 1960s, the forced settlement of nomadic people by the state was going on, which meant that people were kind of forced to live in villages, in these villages that you see here as dots. And then if you are forced to live in a village, you will still hunt and fish, but you would not go that far away from the village. And which meant that these lands, which were traditionally inhabited by these peoples, just became uninhabited. Do you know what time I finish? Is it 7 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and now then this is the end of the part which is called ethnic and linguistic history of Tajmyr. And now the rest of this lecture series will be devoted to individual languages that featured here. And we start with Govorka. Just to start with something. It's something interesting. Can't you fall asleep? And this is the map of the 1940s, 1960s. And this is importantly because for this period we know where Govorka was spoken. And you see here these red areas here and here. So basically Govorka was used as a language of interethnic communication between the Nganasans and the Dolgans, the Enets the Tundra Nenets who migrated here and the Dolgans, and but not between the Nganasans and the Tundra Nenets. Those two ethnic groups could speak the language of each other, and so they didn't use Govorka for this purpose. And then the Govorka was used between the forest Enets and Tundra Nenets who lived here, and the Evenki and the Dolgans who lived here. It's not totally clear how uniform was Govorka in these places, and so most probably there were that the Govorka had ethnolects, so this language was a bit different from this language. And even here, maybe more to the east, where you have more Dolgans, and the language was a bit different from more to the west, where you have more Nganasans. And then, these are the main reference, the main people who studied Govorka, and the main references. So the years when the papers or books were published. And it was again Helimsky who discovered with his publication of 1987 this language. And after that there were other people who were interested in it, and the two of them, Valentin Kusik and Anna Mancheva, that basically they were students. And what I will present you now are the summaries of these works, basically. I have not worked with Govorka myself, but I told you that Govorka was like a pidgin. It was used for interethnic communication, but that's not the whole story. Because basically Govorka was their local Russian for these peoples in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. So from the 1970s, linguists started coming to this area and recording the Nganasan speech, the Dolgan speech, the Evenki speech, the Enets speech, and every time when they had to communicate with these people, the linguists spoke Russian, but basically all these Nganasans, Dolgans, and Enets, they spoke Govorka, so they could not speak any other Russian. It was of course a continuum, so there were people who were better in schools, who had administrative jobs and whose Russian was better, and there were people who kind of had fewer interactions with the Russian-speaking world, and then their Russian was pure Govorka. And I kind of was confronted with Govorka when I started working with some recordings of Enets that were recorded here in this territory. And basically for some Enets texts we have Russian versions. So basically the same consultants were asked to tell the same story in Russian. And then I listen today to this story in Russian, and it's very hard to understand. And I will play you a small piece of it, and those of you who speak Russian will see how little you understand in this speech, even though most words are Russian. So first I will play you this sound, and then I will continue my presentation with lost examples. So this is a piece of Russian. First, this story was told in Nganasan and in Tundra Nenets, and this is a Tundra Nenets. Yeah. So this is a recording that you will hear now. This recording was made by Eugene Helimsky with someone called Tajmyrian, and he's a Tundra Nenets who had migrated to the Nganasan lands and spoke perfectly the Tundra Nenets and Nganasan. And in 1992, so quite recently, he was recorded, and he told the story first in, I don't know, either Nganasan or Tundra Nenets, then the other language. And then he was asked by Eugene Helimsky to tell the same story in Russian. And you will hear him telling the story, and then you'll hear some questions by Eugene Helimsky, and then he will continue. So. It's a Nenets word, it's a name. And that's the name of a story, it's a name for man, it's a name person for the story.
живут, да, он есть, свои девка есть, один девка-то есть.
Он есть, своя девка есть, один девка-то есть. If you don't hear me well.
Да. А бабушка есть, родители есть. И один парень есть.
Бабушка есть, один парень есть.
Один парень-то, им надо много путя найти. Много путя найти.
Один парень, имя-то Нахакучанечи, it's a Nenets name.
Это называют песец говорят. Песец мальчик.
Писец не мальчик.
Тоже это девка-то называют где-то путя где.
Девка-то называет незакученный.
Где путя где. Ага. Но сила, конечно, зима, осень начинает, весной начинает.
Ну, Сима, конечно, Сима осень весной начинает.
Он тундра висит маршрут, да?
Он тундра аргишит маршрута.
Эвлар висели. Понятно, один начать того где-то, один коридор где-то. Это не люди. Но, говорит, нас теперь мотивируют, когда где-то скоро вы.
Okay,
Скоро вы там это
I'll stop here. Now I will show you some examples on the screen. Okay, what are the peculiar features of Govorka? So this Russian nominal morphology was lost almost completely. Yes.
You have Tor. It's so striking. Vignetta.
Yeah.
I wouldn't consider it probably nominal morphology. Or...
No, it's the normal Russian particle Tor,
Yes.
but it's used quite extensively, more extensively than it used in literary standard Russian.
So maybe it's not the Russian particle.
Sorry?
So maybe it's not the Russian particle.
Well, it's a Russian particle which is used, which carries some other thing, something from one of the local languages. Yeah.
Oh, maybe I have a question that should be asked in Edinburgh. Well, how did Govorka originate? Who first started this?
Yes, you'll get the answer later. So, first the general features.
Yeah.
So, almost no Russian morphology in the sense that there are no cases, no case marking and no number marking. And you'll see from the examples. Even though the verbal morphology has been kept much better than nominal morphology. Maybe I show you several sentences, and then I go back to the previous slide which summarized it. So the first sentence means I will speak Russian, which in Russian, in Govorka sounds like «Меня русский Govorka не сказать будет». And if you gloss it following the standard Russian morphology, then instead of I in nominative, you have I in accusative. This is the standard way of saying I in any syntactic position. Then you have Ruski Govorka, which is Russian language, but this Govorka looks like feminine noun, even though the adjective is masculine. Here in square brackets, I show Russian words which are not used the same way as they're used in standard Russian. There is no such a word as Govorka in Russian. There is the verb говорить, and that's how this nominal is used. And then Russian language place, it means in the Russian language. So this is the Russian word for место, but it's used as a postposition. The postposition not only of place, but it is a postposition of manner, of like an instrumental case of these languages. And then you have казать будет, which means I will speak. And first of all, it's a third person singular, so it's not it's third person singular, it's not first person singular. And then this verb in Russian is сказать, so we have the simplification of a consonant cluster in the beginning, and for all these languages, it's not normal to have initial consonant clusters. But also, even if you say сказать, you can't say in standard Russian сказать будет in the meaning he will speak, because we need to say он будет говорить. So basically, you see here already an example of the aspect distinction between perfective aspect verbs and imperfective aspect of verbs have been lost. Okay, the second sentence is вода таскать не хочет его оба, which means the two of them do not want to carry water. And this is water, and it's nominative, even though in standard Russian it must be accusative, but it's not. Then this is the Russian verb for carry, but this is quite colloquial, so you would not use in standard Russian this verb for meaning carry water. You would use a different verb. Even though in local Russian today, this is the verb that will be used. Then you see not want, and it is again third person, the same way it was third person here, even though it's about the third person, but it's singular, even though it's dual. And here you see the analytic dual. This is его, which is accusative, even though it must be nominative, but this is the same way that the pronouns are used, are frozen in the accusative form. And then you have the word for both, and this is kind of analytic pronoun meaning dual, third person dual. And all Samoyedic, Northern Samoyedic languages have the distinction between singular dual and plural. Okay, in the third example, we waited for you. We, many of us, not two of us. And in Govorka it is меня si тебя дожидал. Okay, you see the same accusative pronoun instead of nominative as here. But here, this was analytic modal for dual, and this is analytic modal for plural. So все is все. In Russian, все means all. So first the consonant cluster was simplified, and in Russian you say мы. I mean, you can use a different pronoun for the first person plural, but this is the same pronoun as the first person singular, but with a kind of marker of plural. And this is not occasional. This is also time when you want to say we, you say меня все. So I all. Okay, this is тебя, which is good. We waited for you, and it must be accusative, but this is the just pronouns do not decline, they're always accusative. And this is a nice case for those standard Russian, because in Russian there is no verb. This is wait, but it's lost its reflexive ending. In Russian we need to say дожидался. So it must have this affix at the end, which is reflexive or medial, which means waited. And here it has been lost. And it also is third person singular, even though it's first person plural. And the last sentence is an example of an imperative sentence. It means let me write a letter, and it's maybe it's not the best translation to English. Basically, it's like an imperative to the first. It's an intention that I want to express. And here it is меня пишет батерка, and here the verb is second person singular. So imperatives are frozen in the form of second person, the most frequent one, evidently. Even though like this indicative is third person. And this is second person imperative that is then used for first person, second person, third person. And this is again the subject, which is accusative as everywhere here. And this is a nice word because this is a word for letter, but it's of the Tundra Nenets origin, not of Russian. So there are very few, but there are some Tundra Nenets, some Dolgan, and some Nganasan words in this.
Sorry, about example one. Is место a postposition in that example?
Yes, it is. So, now we've seen see the examples, and you see that the Russian nominal morphology has been lost in the sense that the cases and the number marking was lost. And then some verbal morphology has been retained, like the distinction between indicative and imperative, for example, but not all of them, of course. And possessing the adjectival relations are expressed by just juxtaposition of nouns, and of course a gender agreement like Ruski Govorka has been lost as well. Then there is extensive use of postpositions, even though in Russian there are no postpositions, only prepositions. And then they use some Russian words, for example, mera, which is literally extent, место, which is place, or время, which is phonetically something like время, which means time, and some other. So these are Russian words which are used syntactically as postpositions. Then, for example, analytic dual by pronouns have been developed. So меня оба, меня все, meaning I, both, or I, all. We see also loss of aspect and reflexivity distinction in verbs. And also it's, speaking of what order, it's much more left branching in verb final than original Russian, the standard Russian would have been. And speaking about the lexical, it's mostly Russian words with some cults, like this to particle, which is definitely comes from Russian, but is used following the syntactic model of some other languages. And this is also true for plain mixing, like this Govorka is used as a speech, as a word, as a language. So, and this is the polysemy, which is typical for North of Samoyedic language, which is not typical for Russian. So Russian has a separate word for language, for word, and for speech. And there are some words which are local Russian, which we as speakers of standard Russian, for us it's hard to understand them, but there is nothing particular in them, and they kind of can be easily found in just dialectal dictionaries of Russian, of northern dialects. There are some very few Dolgan, Nenets, or Nganasan words, and these are the most interesting parts for the linguists because they are used to kind of try to reconstruct how this Govorka emerged. So we've seen some examples, and this is just a screenshot from a paper by Tungusic, and this is a piece of a paper which speaks about postpositions. And basically this shows you examples of a postposition mera, which is extent, and that the way it is used is nothing but, has nothing to do with Russian. So, like this example sounds like совсем дом мера или балок мера, такой камень стал, which means the stone became as big as a house, or as big as a local house in this village. And then you see the dom mera, which is house extent, or balok mera, which is balok, which is the local word for this small house on this village, extent. And then the same word is used for temporal meaning. Сам это война мера умирал, which means he died during the war. And this is the word for war, and this is this word for extent. And in Russian, to the standard of comparison and time are never expressed together. There is not a single word that would unite them, for example. And this is also true for all Northern Samoyedic languages. They express the standard of comparison and time very differently. But you have some Dolgan postpositions, like Haga or Khanina, and some derivations from them, which work exactly this way. So this is the word for house, and this is the word for size. No, these are Nganasan examples. So the Dolgan examples go down. So basically, this is a nice case that was used to show that you, with the analysis of particular linguistic items, you can show that they're not Russian and they're not Nganasan, they're not Enets, but they're Dolgan. And then you can take some other things like the postposition место. Further in this paper, you see that it functions not not like in Dolgan, but like in the Samoyedic languages. So kind of you see parts coming from different languages.
Right in Dolgan.
No, no. Well, it's a more complicated story. That's why I'm stop on it. Maybe I skip this. This was a piece of text in Govorka, and this is publication by Anna Urmanchiva, who took quite a long text in Govorka and basically wrote it, transcribed it all down. And if you speak Russian, you can see how it works, but maybe you'll have access to these slides later if you have a look at it. And so the last issue is what is the origin of Govorka. And so the idea first was, before kind of in-depth studies were made, that this was a pidgin. Basically it was a simplified Russian that was used for people for some Russian merchants to talk to local peoples. But then you would see like a typical for pidgins traces of incomplete acquisition, right? So you acquire incomplete languages because you don't have enough exposure to Russian to acquire completely. But then the amount of verbal morphology seems quite strange. And it's kind of the disproportion between the disappearance of normal morphology and the retainance of the verbal morphology is strange. And then Tungusic suggested that maybe we deal here with not with incomplete acquisition, but with incomplete loss. And basically, if you compare the heritage Russian speakers and their language, you also see that the normal morphology is lost much quicker than verbal morphology, for example. So like this case distinction is not really necessary. You can omit it, it's still be understood. And then the idea is that on these maps, you saw some part of Russians living in tundra, and basically it's told us that by the end of the 19th century, these Russians living in tundra, in the borderline between the Nganasan and the Dolgans, their way of life, their clothes, their houses were not houses, but their tents were not different from those of local people. So basically, these Russians, they came there from the mainland Russia to develop agriculture, but it was impossible to develop agriculture in these conditions. So to survive, they had to learn from local people how to hunt, how to fish. They had to learn how to make clothes from what they have, from reindeer skin, and after all, they all switched to Dolgan, basically. And these were these people who kind of were gradually losing their Russian language. And the idea was that maybe this Govorka is their Russian language of those speakers who kind of already didn't acquire it completely, in the sense that their parents spoke it perfectly, and then the children spoke it less well, and then the grandchildren just write some small bits and pieces. And so maybe this is not a typical way of typical history of a pidgin, but more of this story of how a language is lost. And then if you look at the linguistic analysis, also we see that first if we time this different parts of structure of Govorka, then we see that some Dolgan things were earlier than the Nganasan things. And then it's quite clear that the Russians communicated first with the Dolgans, and the Nganasans were much further to the north. But then also later, as we saw in the 20th century, all Nganasans spoke Govorka as their Russian, so kind of it influenced the language a lot. And there is really the studies of Govorka have just started, so it's really ongoing research of Valentin Gusev and Anna Manchiva, and I don't know much about Peter Stern, but it's kind of, there is not so many texts that have been analyzed, and there are more recordings which can be analyzed, and this is really work in progress of these people. And this is my final slide. And you have 7 minutes to ask me something if you want. Yes.
I wonder how right that is, that model, that to say that this specific loss of Russian is different from other pidgins. Wouldn't you just think of these children of Russian settlers to be dominant Dolgan speakers or something that have as input not some other people but their own parents, and so that would be the same similar situation that these Dolgans try to these people who speak these different languages try to communicate using that third language.
No, I think it's more about domains maybe. So if it's a pure pidgin used for trade usually, then the domain is much more specific and the lexicon is narrower.
And then here.
There's another term, Creole.
Sorry?
There's a term Creole.
So it will be
No, Creole is a kind of must be the first language of someone, and Govorka was never the first language of anyone.
So would it really be structurally remarkable from its lexicon? Among pidgins, would it really be? Can you show that the lexicon is different from other pidgins?
We do not have so many Russian-based pidgins, but we have Russianovsk, and we have the Chinese Russian pidgin, and they have much more in common with each other than with Govorka. And Govorka is richer in morphology and rich in its lexicon. But you see, I mean, we don't compare just 3 items to compare. So, and most other pidgins are based on like English, French, I mean, on languages which didn't have that much morphology like Russian. So it's hard to generalize anyway. And generally, this hypothesis that it was the Russian being lost, that was the source of Govorka, it's based on maybe 3 or 4 structural features. Not because others are missing, but because others have not yet been analyzed. So I really think that like in 10 years we'll know more about it.
But if you say that it's Russian being lost, it's the same question to then there were first speakers of, speakers of Russian as first language, who then, gradually lost.
No, they were already speakers of Dolgan.
It was Russian as a heritage language. That's the idea.
Yeah.
But heritage language, isn't it often, one of the first languages?
I'm not sure. I think heritage language is used for those people whose main language of communication is a different one, like Russian speakers in America. Their main language will be English, but they're also speakers of Russian, which is supposed to be their first language, but together with their first language English, but it's kind of not as doesn't equal to standard Russian. Yeah.
Do you know stories about informants who can speak Russian and Govorka and can switch the code?
Yes, the modern elders speak about their parents, and some of them say that, oh, my father was kind of went to some courses, and he could speak quite good Russian, but he would speak this local Russian when he would talk to the Evenkis, and he would speak a much better Russian when he would talk to the Russians. So, yeah, it was something that could be jangled, that you could play with, and yeah. So, and just because you never know what these people mean when they say that someone spoke Russian, because Govorka is a term used by linguists. No one locally uses this word. They all speak about speaking Russian, and then the linguists started using this broken Russian, rusty Russian, in order to kind of try to elicit the difference from the speakers. But they, and often we use examples. So like we would try, and your grandparent, did you speak this way, or did you speak like I speak? So it's really the difference between Govorka and Standard Russian does not exist in local discourse. So it's something which is very hard to kind of take out and reconstruct. So we have 2 more minutes.
Is there a reference as to in which aspect the verb is preserved? In Russian we have both perfective and imperfective. And what is happening in Govorka? Can we say, for example, that most verbs in Govorka are of imperfective aspect from Russian?
I don't know, really. Maybe it's written, you can check the sources and find it out. But basically, what I know is that for each verb, one member of the spectral pair is chosen. But I don't know whether anyone has counted the proportion.
Yeah, and the other question is about the case forms that are preserved. So in the examples we've seen, all the pronouns were accusative and all the nouns were in nominative. Is this generally the case for all the forms you've seen?
Yeah, it looks like this.
Could you please remind me at what time the word emerged? In which century?
Yes, it's a very good question. But it depends a lot on the kind of which hypothesis on the history of Govorka will take up. If you follow Gusev, then it's basically the 19th century, it's the end of the 19th century. But like Helinsky, when he first discovered this speech, he dated it maybe even to the 18th century. So it's really not clear what. So definitely by the end of the 19th century it existed. But
So it's a very interesting hypothesis. I mean, on the other hand, it's very enigmatic why they would use this Russian that they were using in talking with other peoples, with speakers of other languages. So
why couldn't they learn their languages?
there already existed some other patterns of language with Dolgan, Dolgan, something else.
Yeah.
So this is these patterns so equal.
No, well, to answer it shortly, the last lecture we devoted to language contact and lingua franca, so I'll speak more about it. I'm afraid that I can stop now.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
One day.